All right, welcome back, guys, to our last story in the Gnarly Stories of Scripture. We've been going through this huge series studying these different figures of faith, and now we're coming to the end with this last story of Paul and the Viper. And we're headed into a series called Real Rider Stories that I can't wait for you guys to experience. This story, Paul and the Viper, takes place in Acts chapter 28. But to truly understand the gnarliness of this story, you have to look at the story before. In Acts chapter 27, Paul and Luke are prisoners on a Roman ship being sent to Rome for trial. And they're sailing on this ship, and Paul catches wind that a huge storm is coming. And so he informs the crew of the ship that they need to stop, but they stubbornly choose to push on. And they get caught in this gigantic nor'easter. And Scripture says everyone, and I believe including Luke and Paul, was discouraged by this. And I think it wasn't until Paul encounters the Lord later that evening that he gained the confidence to lead this crew to success. This is what the Lord said. The Lord said that not a single person would perish. They would all make it to Rome. So Paul tells this to the crew the next morning, and they end up finding the energy to eat and feast and have fellowship with one another, and then they set about trying to find land. And they eventually shipwreck on an island called Malta. Now, Malta had these natives there that showed unusual kindness to these ship dwellers, and Paul set about to serve them as a thank you for their kindness. And so he's collecting this brush for a fire, and out of nowhere, a poisonous viper leaps out and bites his arm. Now, the natives knew the instant they saw the viper bite that Paul was dead. There was no question he was going to be dead in minutes. But Paul just shook it off into the fire, and the Scripture says they waited to see what happened, and nothing did. Well, the reason nothing did was because of God's promise in the story before. Not a single person would perish, but all of them would make it to Rome. And so through this experience, Paul was able to not only show the love of Jesus through his service, but also the power of God in the same instance, because the Lord was faithful to keep his promise. And in the next story, we find that Paul did indeed make it to Rome, and he had a chance to share the gospel there as well. I want to focus in on this faithfulness for a moment. God has been faithful and will continue to be faithful for all time. If you don't believe me, look back at all the stories we've studied, these gnarly stories of Scripture. God has been incredibly faithful to each of these individuals, making them a promise and then them seeing it come true. In the same instance, this next story we're going to head into of Real Riders Stories, we talk about how people who we know here at JSAW have also experienced the faithfulness of God. Where have you seen the faithfulness of God? Have you seen the faithfulness of God? Because every single one of us has been promised by God that if we accept and believe in Him, we will never perish. That right there is a promise. But He also makes personal promises, like in these stories and the ones to come in the next series. So where has God been faithful in your life? If you haven't seen God's faithfulness, maybe ask for it. And I hope you guys have a great week.